So, today we're going to dive into the story behind one of the biggest uprisings in history. And look, this isn't about one single moment. It's about all the simmering tensions, the broken promises, and the deep-seated anger that finally set India ablaze in 1857. Let's get right into it.
I mean, that's a massive question, right? Because rebellions don't just happen overnight. It's never just one thing. It's more like a slow burn, all these different pressures building up from every corner of society, just waiting for that one single flashpoint. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack here.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to look at this from a few different angles, because each one is a crucial piece of the puzzle. We'll start with the rulers who are losing their power. Then we'll move to the peasants losing their land. And finally, the soldiers who felt completely trapped. And then we'll see how it all came together in a perfect storm.
All right, first up, the fading crowns. Let's talk about India's traditional rulers. You know, the local kings and princes, the Nawabs and Rajas. For centuries, these guys were the center of the universe in their regions. But by the 1800s, well, that power was seriously starting to disappear.
You've got to understand, for about 100 years, the East India Company had been picking apart their power, piece by piece. Think of it less like a new government taking over and more like a hostile corporate takeover. Their armies were told to stand down, their lands and all the money they generated were snatched away, and their authority was just gone. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of their entire world.
And it's the personal stories that really hit home. Take Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. When her husband died, she wanted her adopted son to be named the heir. I mean, that was a totally normal custom. But the company said no and used it as an excuse to just take over her kingdom. For her, this was deeply personal. It was an attack on her family, her rights, her legacy.
Or then you've got Nana Saheb. He was the adopted son of a major ruler, and all he asked for was his father's pension to continue after his death. Simple enough, right? And the company, just brimming with its own power and competence, basically said nope and shut the door. It just shows you how dismissive they were. But the ultimate insult, the real final blow, was aimed at the Mughal dynasty itself. This was the biggest symbol of power in India for centuries, and they told the emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, that once he was gone, his family would be thrown out of their ancestral home, the iconic Red Fort. And check this out, this wasn't some snap decision. It was a cold, calculated plan. First, in 1849, the threat of eviction. Then, a few years later in 1856, they made it official. Bahadur Shah Zafar would be the last Mughal king. After him, his kids would just be called princes. The message couldn't have been clearer. The age of Indian rulers was being erased, by design.
Okay, so while the rulers are losing their crowns, what's happening to the everyday people? This brings us to our next part, the broken land. We're shifting our focus to the folks who actually worked that land, the peasants and local landowners.
This slide really tells a heartbreaking story. On one side, you have tradition. You have families that have worked the same piece of land for generations. It wasn't just a job, it was their identity. But then the company comes in with these impossibly high taxes and super strict rules for collecting them. If you couldn't pay, you had to take out huge loans, and pretty soon, you'd lose the very land your ancestors had farmed. An entire way of life was just crumbling under the weight of debt.
And you know, that kind of anger, it doesn't just stay in the fields. It starts to spread, and it starts to connect with another really powerful group that had its own list of problems.
And that's where the sepoys come in. These were the Indian soldiers who, ironically, the muscle of the company's army. They were the ones enforcing British power, but they were also Indians, and they were facing a massive crisis of their own.
Man, their list of complaints was getting long. They weren't happy about their pay, their allowances, or their working conditions. But the real powder keg? That was the new rules that just trampled all over their religious beliefs. Suddenly, this wasn't just about their job, it was about their soul.
Okay, to really get why this next part is so important, you have to understand this belief about crossing the sea. For a lot of Indians, especially Hindus, traveling overseas was believed to make you lose your religion and your caste, your place in society. It was a huge deal, a massive spiritual taboo.
And look, this wasn't some new, out-of-the-blue conflict. Way back in 1824, a group of sepoys refused to go to Burma because they were ordered to travel by sea. They said, hey, we'll march there, no problem, but they wouldn't cross the ocean. And for that, they were punished harshly. The company just saw it as soldiers not following orders. But for the sepoys, it felt like an attack on their very identity.
So you'd think the company might try to find a middle ground, right? Nope. They doubled down.
In 1856, they passed a new law that said every single new soldier had to agree to serve overseas if ordered. Suddenly there was no choice. It was a deal breaker, a non-negotiable part of the job.
Okay, so let's take a step back. We've got the angry rulers, the desperate peasants, and now the deeply offended soldiers. You can see how this is all building, right? The separate streams of anger are starting to flow together. This is the gathering storm.
And this is the absolute key to understanding how it all connected. The sepoys weren't just soldiers living in some isolated bubble. A lot of them were basically peasants in uniform. They came from the exact same villages that were being crushed by taxes. The stories of their families losing land were their stories. So all that anger from the countryside, it was pouring right into the army barrack.
So when you stack it all up, it's just, wow. You've got the rulers stripped of their honor and their power. You have the peasants stripped of the land their families had worked for centuries. And then you have the sepoys who came from those same lands feeling like they were being stripped of their very faith. Each problem was piling on top of the last, creating this society-wide crisis. It wasn't just one group's problem anymore, it was everyone.
So from the highest palace to the smallest farm, to the army barracks, everyone felt the pressure. The sense of injustice was everywhere. You could feel the tension in the air. The kindling was dry, the tinderbox was full, and the fire was already lit. The only question left was what would be the final spark.
Just imagine this for a second. You're on a journey, minding your own business, and a group of strangers stops you with a terrifying warning. Turn back. Go home, because in just 3 days, everything is about to explode. Well, that's a true story. It happened to a traveler in India, right before one of the biggest uprisings in its entire history.
All right, so let's get right into it. We're turning the clock back to 1857 to really dig into the stories, the whispers, and the deep-seated fears that finally ignited this massive rebellion against British rule in India. We're going to see how a few personal stories can shed light on a huge historical firestorm.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the scene. What was the general vibe at the time? Then, we're going to hear from two people who were right there on the ground, a civilian traveler and a loyal soldier. After that, we'll see how their very different stories actually connect, and finally, piece together how all of this led to an unavoidable explosion. Okay, so first things first, a society in flux. To really get what happened, you have to understand the tension in the air. By the middle of the 1800s, there was this really deep, nagging anxiety spreading across India about all the changes the British were bringing in. Now look at this list. From the British point of view, these probably looked like positive, progressive reforms, right? Stopping the practice of sati, encouraging education. But for a lot of Indians, this felt like a full-on attack on their way of life. And when Christian missionaries suddenly could own land, and a new law made it easier for people who converted to Christianity to inherit family property, well, the fear got really specific. It started to look like a deliberate plot to destroy their culture and their religions.
And that's really the heart of it. This powerful feeling started to spread that the British weren't just ruling, they were trying to tear down the very fabric of Indian society. And that created a massive foundation of distrust.
So let's see what that distrust actually felt like for an ordinary person on the ground. This brings us to our first-hand account, from someone just trying to live their life.
Meet Vishnu Bhatt Gadse. He's a Brahmin, a priest from Maharashtra. And he's just on a trip, trying to get to a religious ceremony in Mathura. He has absolutely no clue that he's about to walk straight into a gathering storm.
And there it is. That's the chilling warning I mentioned. He gets stopped by sepoys, Indian soldiers who worked for the British, and they tell him in no uncertain terms, go back. And they don't just say, trouble's brewing. They give him a deadline. 3 days. Can you imagine hearing that? Suddenly the threat isn't some vague worry, it's immediate, it's real.
So, what was this all about? Well, the sepoys told him. It was all because of a rumored secret plan, a conspiracy they called the 84 Rules. And they believed this was the official British playbook for wiping out both Hinduism and Islam.
And this is what's so fascinating. Look how detailed this rumor was. This wasn't just some vague anxiety. No, this was a whole story. It had characters, the kings. It had a setting, a meeting in Calcutta. It had drama, angry warnings of dire consequences. And it had a plot, a secret plan for a holy war being passed around from the army base in Meerut. It's that level of detail that makes a rumor feel true. It makes it persuasive. Okay, so that's the view from the outside.
based on rumors flying around on the road. Now, let's switch gears and see what was happening inside the British Army, from a soldier who saw everything unfold.
This is Subedar Sitaram Pandey, and his story is just incredible. He served the British for almost 48 years, and, get this, he stayed loyal through the rebellion, even after his own son joined the rebels and was killed in the fighting. His viewpoint as a loyalist on the inside is just an unbelievable window into what the soldiers were thinking.
Now for Sitaram, the problem wasn't some list of rules. He points his finger at a specific political event, when the British just took over the Kingdom of Oudh. He says that was the moment that trust was completely shattered. It was a total betrayal, and it made the soldiers think the government couldn't be trusted at all.
Sitaram basically lays out the dominoes for us. First, you have the political anger over Oudh, which creates this perfect, fertile ground for resentment to grow. Then, you've got agents of the king who lost his throne sneaking around, stirring up that anger in the army. And right into that toxic mix, the British introduce a new rifle with new cartridges. And then the final domino falls. The explosive rumor that the cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to the beliefs of both Hindus and Muslims.
And here's Sitaram's key insight. He says that people with their own agendas immediately tied the cartridges to that bigger fear of forced conversion. The logic was simple, and it was absolutely terrifying. If you bite the cartridge, your faith is defiled. You become an outcast, and then you're easier to convert to Christianity. That cartridge wasn't just a piece of ammunition anymore. It was a weapon aimed at their very souls.
So now we have these two really powerful stories. One from a civilian, one from a soldier. Let's put them together and see how all these whispers of war started to sound like an undeniable reality. So, what was the actual threat here? Was it a list of 84 rules, like Vishnu Bhat Godse was told? Or was it the greased cartridges that Sitaram Pandey was so worried about? Which one was it?
Well, when you put them side by side, you realize they're just two different flavors of the exact same fear. The 84 rules rumor is this big, top-down government conspiracy. The cartridge rumor is a more sneaky, ground-level military plot. But they both end up at the exact same conclusion. The British are trying to destroy our faith.
And in the end, that's what mattered. The specific details, whether it was a rule or a rifle, they almost didn't matter. These rumors were just containers for the same poison, a complete and total collapse of trust. That core fear, the fear of losing their entire way of life, that's the one thing that everybody understood. And when you have a fear that powerful, gripping everyone from civilians to soldiers, well, the stage is set. It stopped being a question of if a rebellion would happen, and it became a question of when.
Right, and these stories weren't just isolated whispers. The source material is clear that soldiers and civilians were meeting in the markets, in the bazaars, sharing news, spreading these rumors. The military world and the civilian world were feeding each other's fears, creating this massive, invisible powder keg all across northern India. All it needed was one tiny spark.
Which really leaves us with one last big question. Back in 1857, the belief in a plot against religion became more real, more powerful than any actual law or government policy. It just makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of history, even today, is shaped not by what is factually true, but by the powerful, compelling stories that people believe are true. Today, we're jumping into one of the most incredible events in Indian history, the massive uprising of 1857. What we're going to do is trace the story of how a small soldiers' mutiny, in one place, somehow exploded into a huge rebellion that really shook the British East India Company to its core. Okay, so let's dive right in. The whole thing was kicked off by a single explosive rumor. But, to understand why it caught fire so fast, we have to look back at the century of pressure that came before it. The country was just simmering with tension. So, before we get to the spark, we have to talk about the powder keg. For 100 years, the British East India Company had been methodically and systematically expanding its power all across the subcontinent.
I mean, think about that. A full century of conquest and taking over. Local rulers were being pushed aside, and traditional ways of life were being totally turned upside down. This long stretch of foreign expansion created a political landscape that was just ripe for a massive pushback. The only thing missing was a trigger.
And that trigger, it came in the form of a mutiny. Now, it's super important to get this term. A mutiny is a very specific thing. It's when soldiers in the military, as a group, just flat out disobey their officers. And that's exactly where this story gets started.
inside the army barracks. And what's really fascinating here is that this massive conflict, this whole thing, it all came down to a new piece of military hardware. Yeah, the introduction of a new rifle cartridge. Well, that would prove to be the tiny spark that lit the flame of a revolution.
Things escalated incredibly fast. It starts in late March with one soldier, a guy named Mangal Pandey, who decides to make a stand. Then this rumor starts spreading like wildfire. The new rifle cartridges are greased with cow and pig fat. Now, this was deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. So when the soldiers, or sepoys, in the city of Meerut refuse to use them, the British response is incredibly harsh. 85 of them are publicly shamed and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor.
But you know what? That brutal punishment didn't crush the dissent. Not even close. It did the exact opposite. It provoked an immediate, extraordinary, and actually very well-organized response from the other soldiers.
On May 10th, literally the very next day, the comrades of those imprisoned men took action. And this wasn't chaos, it was a plan. They marched on the jail, they freed the prisoners, they attacked British officers, and they grabbed all the guns and ammunition they could. Then they made their goal crystal clear. They set off on an overnight ride to the historic capital city of Delhi.
And this move just brilliantly illustrates what they were after. They declared war on the Firangis. And this wasn't just a neutral word for foreigners, oh no, it was loaded with contempt. Their mission wasn't just about a rifle cartridge anymore, it was about ending foreign rule in their country.
But okay, if you're gonna overthrow the existing power, that raises a pretty big question, right? Well, the soldiers were marching to Delhi because they already had an answer in mind.
And their answer was the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. Now, his actual power was mostly symbolic by this point, but he was the living descendant of a dynasty that had ruled over huge parts of India for centuries. He was really the only person with the kind of historical legitimacy to unite the country. So when the sepoys show up at the Red Fort in Delhi, the aging emperor was, pretty understandably, not exactly eager to pick a fight with the mighty British. But the soldiers, they were determined. They literally forced their way into the palace and pretty much made him accept their demand. He was going to be the leader of the rebellion.
And this one single, reluctant decision, it would have massive implications. This right here, this is the precise moment that a local army mutiny starts to transform into a nationwide popular rebellion.
Once he accepted the role, Bahadur Shah didn't hesitate. He started sending out letters to all the other chiefs and rulers across the country. And the message was simple. Come forward, join us, and let's organize a great confederacy of Indian states to fight the British together. So, and this is so crucial, his endorsement was a complete game changer. The Mughal names still carried immense weight. For all the smaller rulers who felt like they were being squeezed by British expansion, the emperor provided a real, legitimate alternative. And just like that, this wasn't just some chaotic uprising anymore. It was a movement with a credible leader and a really clear goal: restore the old order. And the British, they completely and totally misread the situation. They thought this whole thing was just a minor disturbance over some rifle cartridges that would blow over soon. They had absolutely no idea how dramatically the emperor's decision had changed, well, everything.
And this right here is the key to understanding the whole transformation. What the British just failed to grasp was the power of a symbol. Bahadur Shah Zafar offered people an alternative. He gave them a vision of a future without British rule, and that vision gave countless others the courage, the hope, and the confidence they needed to finally rise up and act.
Which leaves us with a really powerful final thought. This story shows us that for a bunch of scattered acts of resistance, to become a full-blown revolution, you need more than just a common enemy. You need a shared vision for the future, a credible alternative that inspires people to believe that change is actually truly possible.
Today, we're diving into a really pivotal moment in history, the Indian Rebellion of 1857. We're going to explore how a single act of defiance spiraled into this massive nationwide uprising. And it all kicks off not with a huge bang, but with a strange, kind of deafening silence. So just imagine the scene, okay? Rebel soldiers have just taken the capital, Delhi. The British have been totally routed. You'd think there'd be chaos, right? Instant action all across the country. But nope. Instead, this really eerie quiet just settles over everything for almost a whole week. It's like the entire subcontinent is just holding its breath. So what on earth breaks that silence? Well, that silence, that was the sound of news traveling. We're talking about an age with no internet, no phones, nothing. Word of the victory in Delhi had to spread the old-fashioned way, town by town, person by person. But once it did, that single spark caught fire and set off this incredible domino effect all across northern India. And this wasn't just random chaos. There was a clear pattern to how it all went down. First, it starts with the military units, the sepoys, mutinying against their British commanders. Then, as the news of their success in Delhi gets out, it moves to stage 2. Regular people in towns and villages join the fight. And finally, and this part is so crucial, local leaders step up to actually organize everything. That's how a military mutiny literally transformed into a full-blown popular revolt. Now, an uprising this huge, it needs leadership, and people from all walks of life rose to the occasion, commanding these new fronts that were opening up against the British, especially in the big key cities. In Kanpur, for instance, you have Nana Saheb. Now, as the adopted son of the former Peshwa, he already had a claim to leadership. So he gathers his forces, kicks the British out, and declares himself governor. But here's the really interesting part. He did it all under the authority of the Mughal emperor. This tells you it wasn't just some local power grab. It was a clear signal that they wanted to restore a unified, pre-British order. The story over in Lucknow is pretty similar, but with this fascinating twist. Burgess Qadr, the young son of the Nawab who'd just been kicked out, was named the new ruler, and he too acknowledged the emperor in Delhi. But the real force behind the throne here? His mother, Begum Hazrat Mahal. She became a central organizer of the entire uprising, an incredibly powerful leader in her own right. And then, of course, there's the legendary Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. She didn't just sit back. She joined the rebel soldiers to fight the British head-on. Her story also shows you the power of making alliances. She fought side by side with Tantia Tope, who was Nana Saheb's brilliant general. They combined their strengths, and they were a force to be reckoned with. But the leadership wasn't just in the most famous states. Way down in the Mansla region of Madhya Pradesh, another queen, Rani Avantabai Lodi of Ramgarh, took charge. When the British tried to take over her state, she didn't just write a letter of protest. No, she raised and personally led a massive army against them. Just think about that number for a second. 4,000 soldiers? This wasn't a small skirmish. We're talking about a significant military force, raised and led by one woman in one region. It just shows you the incredible scale and depth of the resistance. And with forces like that popping up on so many fronts, you can imagine the tide began to turn, and turn dramatically. For decades, the British had this aura of being invincible, but with every single rebel victory, that myth started to crack. All of a sudden, the British were on the back foot. They were massively outnumbered, and they were getting defeated in battle after battle. For ordinary people watching this, it was real, concrete proof that British rule could actually end, and that gave them the confidence they needed to join the fight themselves. Hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to what the British themselves were saying. This is from a telegram sent by Lieutenant Colonel Tytler to his commander-in-chief. He says, "Our men are cowed." That's a powerful word. He's admitting his soldiers are terrified by the sheer numbers and the non-stop fighting. And then he says, "Every village is held against us." Wow. This wasn't just an army they were fighting, it was the entire country. And the leadership just kept expanding beyond the royalty and the well-known figures. The uprising started pulling in leaders from completely different backgrounds, which just proves how widespread this movement had truly become. I mean, just look at the diversity here. In Faizabad, you've got Ahmadullah Shah, a religious scholar, a Maulvi, saying the end of British rule is near. In Delhi, a common soldier, Bakht Khan, rises through the ranks to become a key military commander. In Bihar, an old landlord, Kunwar Singh, picks up a sword and battles the British for months. And then you have the Ghazis, religious warriors, flooding into Delhi. It was this incredible, unlikely coalition. So yeah, what started with a single mutiny by a few soldiers spread like an absolute wildfire. In the end, it pulled in leaders and fighters from every corner of society. Queens, soldiers, prophets, and landlords, all of them found themselves united against one common enemy. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful question. When you have such a diverse group of people, with totally different backgrounds, different personal motivations, different goals, all joining the same fight, what is the one single idea that's powerful enough to unite every single one of them? What was it that drove them all forward, together? It's definitely something to think about. Today, we're going to get into a really decisive and, frankly, brutal moment in history, how the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857 was systematically crushed. So let's just start with the big question, right? How do you crush a massive rebellion? I mean, it's a tough thing to think about, but it's the exact problem the British East India Company was staring down. When an entire subcontinent seems to be rising up, what on earth does it take to get that control back? And you've got to understand, they were completely shaken. The source material uses the word unnerved, and I think that's putting it mildly. This wasn't just some small protest. We're talking about a huge, popular uprising that put their entire future in India at risk. The stakes just couldn't have been higher. So when you're faced with a threat that big, what do? Well, the company's response was absolute. They decided they were going to repress this revolt with every single bit of power they could possibly summon. There was no room for negotiation. And they were methodical about it. They rolled out this clear 3-part plan. First, get fresh troops, reinforcements, shipped in straight from England. Second, change the laws, basically create a legal weapon to make it way easier to convict rebels. And third, go straight for the jugular. Attack the storm centers, the very heart of the rebellion. So with that plan locked in, the British started the long, difficult process of taking back the key cities that had turned into rebel strongholds. This was going to be a city-by-city fight. And their number one target, right out of the gate, was Delhi. Why Delhi? Well, it was all about symbolism. Delhi was the heart of the rebellion. It's where the rebels had declared the old Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their leader. If the British could retake Delhi, it would be a massive psychological blow to the whole movement. But, and this is a huge but, this was not a quick fight. Just look at this timeline. Delhi falls in September of 57, but the fighting just rages on. Lucknow isn't taken until March of the next year. And you see famous leaders like Rani Lakshmibai and Tantia Tope are defeated months or even years later. This was a long, brutal war. Let that number just sink in for a second. 2 full years. That alone tells you everything about the scale of the resistance. This wasn't some simple military mutiny. The source calls it massive forces of popular rebellion. It took 2 years of nonstop warfare to finally stamp it out. Okay, so taking back territory was one thing, but the British knew that to really extinguish the rebellion for good, they had to deal with its leaders. They had to cut the head off the snake. Just look at what happened to the emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. This was all very methodical. He wasn't just killed on a battlefield. No, he was captured, put on trial, sentenced to life in prison, and then exiled all the way to Rangoon. When he died in that prison years later, it wasn't just the end of his life, it was the final, undeniable end of the entire Mughal Empire. And, of course, other legendary figures met their end right in the middle of the fight. Rani Lakshmibai, one of the most powerful and inspiring leaders of the rebellion, was defeated and killed in battle in June of 1858. And then there was Tantia Tope, who was just so resilient. He managed to escape the big city battles and led this fierce guerrilla war from the jungles of central India, getting support from local, tribal, and peasant leaders. He held out for an incredibly long time, but eventually he too was captured, put on trial, and killed in April 1859. You know, this quote here really gets to the heart of the psychological side of the war. Momentum was everything. In the beginning, when the rebels were winning, it encouraged more and more people to join them. But as the British started taking back cities and picking off leaders one by one, that momentum completely reversed. Hope started to fade, and people began to desert the cause. So this brings us to the final piece of the British strategy. They were smart enough to know that pure military force alone wouldn't guarantee long-term control. They needed something more, a mix of tactics. So they used this classic carrot and stick approach. The stick was brutal and very public. Hundreds of people, sepoys, rebels, even nawabs and rajas were tried and hanged. But then there was the carrot. They gave rewards to landholders who had stayed loyal. They promised them that their traditional rights to their land would be protected. They even made an offer directly to the rebels, kind of an olive branch. But it came with some really big conditions. They said you'd be safe and you could keep your land, but only if you submitted to the British. And, this was the big one, only if you hadn't killed any white people. It was a really calculated move to split the rebellion and get people to surrender. So when you put it all together, you can see how they did it. It was this combination of overwhelming military power, a relentless campaign to hunt down the leaders, and a very clever political strategy of punishment and reward. It was a total systematic effort to crush the rebellion from every angle. Which kind of leaves us with this final, heavy question. When an uprising is ended, not just with guns and swords, but also with laws and promises of forgiveness, what is it that's really been defeated? Is it just an army, or is it something bigger? An idea, maybe? A whole different future for a country that for 2 years felt like it was almost within reach. Definitely something to think about. So picture this, it's 1857, and a massive rebellion has just ripped through India, shaking the very foundations of British power. Now fast forward 2 years to 1859. The fighting's over. Britain has won, sure, but it was a brutal, bloody victory, and their control over the subcontinent is in tatters. The old way of doing things, totally finished. So the big question was, what now? This is the story of how they tried to rebuild their empire right from the ashes. I mean, just look at this image. It really captures the violent end of that rebellion. British troops storming Delhi, leaving absolute destruction behind them. But here's the thing. A victory like this, won with overwhelming force, didn't actually solve the underlying problems. It just left the British with a country they held by the sword and an empire whose legitimacy was, well, completely ruined. And that really gets to the heart of the issue they were facing. By the end of 1859, yeah, they had military control back, but the system they'd been using for 100 years, the rule of the East India Company, which was this weird hybrid of a private corporation with its own army acting like a government, that system was officially totally broken. This quote from the time, it just nails it. The failure was so complete, the shock to the system so profound that just patching things up wasn't going to cut it. No way. They had to start from scratch. A complete overhaul was really the only option on the table. So what's the first and biggest change they make? Well, the East India Company, that incredibly powerful trading corporation that had been running the show in India for a century, was fired. Just like that, its rule was over. And taking its place? Direct control from the British government, all the way from London. And this huge change was made official with a really pivotal piece of law, the Act of 1858. This act formally dissolved all of the East India Company's power and handed over all of its responsibilities directly to the British Crown. This moment right here is the official beginning of what we all know as the British Raj. This little chart breaks down the shift perfectly. Before 1858, you've got a company in charge. After, the crown itself. And look at the title change for the top job. It goes from Governor General to Viceroy. Viceroy literally means in place of the king. So this wasn't just a symbolic name change, you know? It meant that the person ruling India was now a direct representative of the Queen, answering directly to the UK Parliament. Okay, so with this new structure locked in, the British essentially wrote a brand new playbook for their empire. They brought in a whole series of strategic policies, and all of them were designed with one single overriding goal: to make sure a rebellion like 1857 could never, ever happen again. First, they dealt with the local rulers, the chiefs and princes. Instead of just conquering them, they offered a new kind of deal. Your territory is safe. We won't annex it, and you can pass it to your kids. But you have to acknowledge our queen as your ultimate ruler. This basically turned potential enemies into loyal, subordinate allies. Second, they completely remade the army. The number of Indian soldiers, the sepoys, was slashed, while the number of European troops was seriously boosted to make sure there was always a loyal fighting corps. And this gives you a brilliant visual of that new military logic. You can see how they fundamentally changed who they recruited. They stopped taking soldiers from the heartlands of the rebellion, those central areas. Instead, they recruited heavily from communities they now considered more trustworthy, based on a new and pretty controversial theory of martial races. They believed certain groups were just naturally better soldiers, so they started recruiting more Gurkhas, Sikhs, and Pathans. It was a cold, calculated strategy to build an army that, they hoped, would never turn on them again. But, military and political control can only get you so far. The British knew they also had to figure out how to manage Indian society itself. Their new strategy was a bit of a two-pronged attack: divide the population where it helped them, while at the same time carefully building a new base of loyal supporters. This led to a very deliberate, and you could say deeply divisive, double standard. On the one hand, the British publicly promised to respect local religious and social customs, but on the other hand, they treated the Muslim population with intense suspicion, widely blaming them for the rebellion. Their land and property were confiscated on a massive scale, which, as you can imagine, created huge, long-lasting resentment. This brings us to their core economic strategy, which you can really boil down to this simple idea right here. Secure the land, secure the loyalty. The British figured out that to really maintain control, they needed powerful Indian allies who had a personal, financial reason to support the system. And this policy was the absolute cornerstone of that idea. The British made a very specific choice to protect the power and property of landlords and zamindars. These were local landholders who collected taxes. They were guaranteed their rights over their lands, and why? Well, it's pretty straightforward. This created a powerful, wealthy class of Indians whose prosperity was now directly tied to the stability and survival of the British Raj. They became a crucial pillar of support for the whole colonial government. So when you add it all up, you've got direct rule from London, a completely re-engineered army, and these new social and economic policies. It becomes really clear that this was way more than just a course correction. This was the beginning of an entirely new era. You can really see that transition in these two images. On one side, you have the raw, chaotic violence of putting the rebellion down, and on the other, what grew out of that chaos. Not more chaos, but a new, highly structured, very calculated system of imperial control that was designed to last. This sentence just captures the scale of the moment perfectly. The year 1857 is a watershed. The policies that were put into place right after it would go on to define the relationship between Britain and India for the next 90 years, all the way up to independence. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The British Raj was engineered with precision. It was built to be permanent. But did the very tools they used to maintain control, dividing communities, creating these loyal elites, relying on military power, did those policies end up creating the very cracks and resentments that would fuel the great independence movements of the next century? It's a fascinating question, isn't it?
Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we are diving deep into an incredible story of resistance from 19th century India. It's about a rebellion whose impact, its echo, lasted so much longer than the fighting itself. We're talking about the Khurda uprising of 1817.
So when you think about major uprisings against the British in India, what's the first date that pops into your head? It's 1857, right? Pretty much everyone calls it the First War of Independence. But what if I told you that a full 40 years before that, a massive popular armed uprising had already rocked the British to their core?
All right, here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to travel back to the Kingdom of Khurda to see what pushed these people to the edge. We'll look at how the Pikes fought back and then unpack the surprising aftermath. We'll even take a quick trip around the world for some context before we really focus on the lasting legacy of this incredible struggle.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. We're in Khurda, which is in modern-day Odisha. It's the very start of the 19th century, and Khurda is a proud and prosperous kingdom. But things are about to change.
In 1803, the British East India Company marches in. Now, the local king, Mukundi Dev II, he'd actually tried to make a deal with them. But the British, well, they had their own ideas. They took over his lands, kicked him off the throne, and basically left him with a tiny allowance and management of the Jagannath Temple. It was a huge betrayal, and it marked the beginning of a really oppressive new era for the whole kingdom. Now, to understand this story, you absolutely have to know about the Pikes. These weren't just your average soldiers, they were the backbone of the entire kingdom. For generations, they'd served the king, and in return, they got tax-free land to farm. It was this whole system built on loyalty and service, a system the British were about to tear apart.
So, with the British calling the shots, life in Khurda went from bad to worse, really fast. It wasn't just one thing, it was this steady stream of policies that, for the people, felt like the final straws. You see, this was a systematic attack on their entire way of life. First, the British took away the Pikes' land, the very thing that gave them their livelihood and their status. Then, they cranked up taxes like crazy. They demanded payment in a new silver currency that nobody had. They created a monopoly on salt, a basic necessity, which made prices shoot up. And to top it all off, they started auctioning off local land to the highest bidder. It was a total disaster for the local people.
And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures the personal cost of all this. It's talking about Baxi Jagabandhu, the military commander of the kingdom. This guy was one of the most respected figures around, and British policies literally turned him into a beggar. His story was everyone's story, which is exactly why he became the leader of the rebellion. So, by 1817, the whole region is just a tinderbox. The anger, the frustration, it's all just simmering right below the surface. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was about to ignite. And then, boom, March 1817, it all kicks off. The Payaks start attacking police stations, government buildings, anything that represents British rule. Within a month, Baxi Jagabandhu is leading an army of up to 10,000 rebels. They actually seized the major city of Puri. Now, the British managed to contain the main fighting pretty quickly, but the resistance, it was far from over. In fact, it lasted. Baxi Jagabandhu kept up a guerrilla war for another 8 years before he finally surrendered. 8 years! So yeah, the military fight was eventually lost. The British declared martial law, they captured the king, they hunted down the leaders. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, you could say the most lasting part of the uprising was just getting started. This is where you see this amazing contradiction. On one hand, you have brutal suppression. But on the other, the British were clearly shaken. They realized their harsh policies had completely backfired, so they changed their whole approach. They started being more lenient, they fired corrupt officials, they lowered the price of salt, and they even gave some of the land back. So while the Pikes lost the battles, their fight forced a real, lasting change in how the British ruled.
Now, to really get the big picture, it helps to remember that this urge to fight back against injustice wasn't just happening in Korda. This was a global thing. All around the world, people were rising up, even if their reasons were totally different. So, let's jump over to southern China for a minute. Just as the story in Herda is winding down, a new one is heating up. In 1850, a massive popular uprising kicks off that would become known as the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil wars in all of human history. And when you compare these two rebellions, you see some really fascinating differences. The Pikes were fighting to bring back the past, to restore their old way of life. The Taiping rebels, they wanted to build a totally new future, a heavenly kingdom based on radical social reforms. And here's the wild part. The Pikes fought against the British, but the British actually helped the Chinese government crush the Taiping Rebellion. Talk about a strange twist, right?
Okay, so let's bring it all back home. Back to Khurda and its legacy. Why are we still talking about this uprising over 200 years later? Why does it still matter? Here's the most important takeaway. Calling it just a Pike Rebellion kind of misses the point. This was bigger. This was a popular, widespread, anti-British uprising that included everyone from local leaders to the common person. It was one of the first major signs that colonial rule wouldn't be accepted quietly, and as we saw, its impact created a lasting shift in how the British governed that part of India.
And that kind of leaves us with one final big question to think about. The Khurda uprising was defeated on the battlefield, but its influence, its echo, lived on for years. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is it that makes a rebellion's impact truly last, long, long after the final battle is over?